Segregation. When I was younger, I would read world atlases, and sometimes I would come to an article, say an article on the country of Colombia, and I would say that Colombia, and it would say that Colombia is a world leader in coffee production, and then list off some other cash crops. Then it would go into the growing textile sector and mention that it has some problems with debt. Maybe it's a leading producer of phosphates as well or something. And if you read all of this quantitative, subjective description, you would never realize that Colombia was poor. Not until you get to the per capita GDP that would discover that it was 3,000 per capita. You could also have some qualitatively you could also have someone qualitatively describe a football game between Auburn and Alabama, and they could do highlights and describe some of the big plays. And you wouldn't know that Alabama completely steamrolled Auburn until you looked at the box score. Or imagine if your son was describing quantitatively and subjectively how he was doing in his classes. As a parent, you don't care. You want to see the damn grades. And so, the effect of segregation on blacks, what does the data say? Because in school, when segregation is taught, it's the equivalent of describing a football game by just looking at the highlights and not the score box. It's cat lady story time. Well, there are a few big go-to topics that popped into my mind to try to qualify the effects of segregation on blacks. Cops and courts, schools, incomes, and lynchings. So that's what I'm gonna to do. This is Spencer McGreal, by the way. We are reading Segregation from the alternatehypothesis.org, written by Ryan Falk. Please like and subscribe. Incarceration rate. The incarceration rate for blacks relative to whites has increased at least since 1930, probably long before that. So in terms of blacks being targeted or being sent to prison, it looks like they were substantially less targeted compared to today. So if the legal system were unfair during segregation, they appear to be even more unfair today. Perhaps they weren't unfair during segregation, perhaps they weren't unfair during segregation, are unfair today, or perhaps the laws are different today in a way that disparently impacts blacks more than they did in the past. There are also sort of things we can speculate, but it's not immediately or obviously apparent from the data that the legal system was particularly keen on incarcerating blacks compared to today. Prison sentences. For prison sentences, the numbers have been remarkably stable. When you look at the length of prison terms for blacks compared to whites after the first release from prison, it's very close. The first release data is important because none of these are repeat offenders. Repeat offenders get more time, and blacks are more likely to be repeat offenders. That said, based on the data below, blacks serve roughly 15% longer prison terms for their first terms. It could be because of crimes blacks commit with each category are on average more severe, or it could be racial bias on the parts of the judges. I remember there was a study that was done that was about, black people were more likely to get caught when they were selling drugs. And someone remarked, well, that's because they're selling drugs in open in public, whereas whites were selling drugs like in their big houses in the suburbs. It could be that blacks have worse courtroom behavior, and when IQ is controlled for, the racial gaps in prison sentences go away. But what you don't see is blacks having longer prison sentences during segregation. Oh, that's interesting. Now, I haven't read this article before. Now, if we look at the median prison time served in just the South and blacks in 1937, smack in the middle of Jim Crow, and include repeat offenders, of which black inmates are a higher proportion today, the result is not that much different from the entire of the U.S. One thing I love about Mr. Ryan Falk is him looking at the data, right, compared to other people that are just like, slavery is bad. Well, let's look at the data. Remember, in 1937, data is just from the South, supposedly the hot seat of bigotry, and includes repeat offenders. Homicide data is unweighed average of each category. In 1937 and 1952, they used murder and manslaughter. In 1964, they just had homicide. In 2009, they had murder, negligent manslaughter, and non-negligent manslaughter. I remember when I was younger and I first started looking into like anti-feminist literature, I remember they came up with what was it? Was it not manslaughter? One of the terms that we use today because they couldn't convict, maybe it's like second degree or the different degrees of murder, because they couldn't convict women on like killing people because the juries felt bad for women and would let them go. And they're like, well, this woman clearly killed somebody. We have to invent like lesser charges, or else women are just going to keep walking free after they like poison their neighborhood. We have to lock them up for something. It can't be hysteria. Uh, Anyway, sorry. In case you think I am cherry picking the years to paint a particular narrative, these are literally just the years used in the Bureau of Justice reporting I am citing. And so what we see is that the black-white incarceration gap is wider today than it was in 1930. In addition, the racial gap in sentencing lengths for the excuse me, the first offenders does not appear to have changed at all. Even the data that included repeat offenders in the South in 1937 doesn't differ that much from the first-time offenders data nationally and later. And so this makes the idea of the current U.S. legal system being more biased against blacks during segregation than it is today seem false. Lynching. We're going to go on lynching. We're going to pass all the go straight to jail for the lynching. Um, a related topic to this is lynching. From Richard M. Peterloft, professor of communications at Cleveland State University, approximately 4,742 individuals were lynched between 1882 and 1968. The victims, 3,445, or 73%, were black. All lynchings were in response to a criminal offense, such as rape or stealing cattle. Blacks were 72, I can't read, 72.65% of all recorded lynchings, while being only 26.87% of the population of the South at the time. The black population in the southern U.S. 1880 to 1970 averages 26.87 at each decade. And so that's pretty high. And so the base of their population alone, if lynchings were racially neutral and were nothing about race differences and violent crimes going in, we would expect 26.87% of all lynchings to be blacks. Blacks comprise 72.65% of all lynchings, giving them a representation of 2.70 times their population. However, according to Wikipedia, most lynchings occurred between 1882 and 1920, and during that time period, the average black population was 31.76% of the southern U.S. population. Using this number, blacks as a percentage of lynchings are only 2.29 times their percentage of the population. If we split the difference and just say that black population in the South was 29.32% of the population, then blacks as a percentage of lynchings were 2.8 times their percentage of the population. Okay, Ryan, we fucking get it. By comparison, in 2010, blacks comprised 12.6% of the U.S. total population, but were 38.13% of the population charged for violent crimes, giving them a representation of 3.3 times their population. Whoa, baby! And so by raw numbers, the lynching mobs, roaming, looking for black people. And so by the raw numbers, the lynching mobs appear to be slightly less racially targeting than the current U.S. Legal system is. Here are the numbers put into a table. Thank you. Yeah, the lynching thing, I guess it's just the argument that uh, blacks are more violent, I guess. I don't know. Proportion. Okay. Income. This is where arguments regarding the negative effects of segregation start to have some backing in data. Looking at the census data from 1948, we can see that black incomes as proportion to white incomes went from 44% in 1948 to about 80% in 2000. This looks like a massive effect of desegregation on its face. We gotta go deep. We go deep here. However, there is some interesting data from 1880. Excuse me, I misspoke. If you look within regions, the racial gap is much less. At that time, workers earned a median of 37% of what white workers earned. However, if you look at the South, blacks earned 58% of what white workers earned. Excuse me. So with regional control, we already have almost half the way to the current black-white income ratio. The paper did something else. It looked at black labor income relative to whites, but looked at a rural southern whites and blacks, and it only looked at labor income. In that instance, black income was 89% of white income. And so when you look at the same region and the same kind of work and just compare the wages of workers, the black-white income gap in the rural South is only 11% lower than it is today. And the difference could be very plausibly due to blacks having fewer skills on average in 1880. I would be interested to see similar thin slices just looking at urban blacks in the South versus urban whites in the South and urban blacks in the North to urban whites in the North. I suspect that the more held consistent region and urban-rural divide, the similar the racial gaps would be. Which is to say, it seems much of the black-white income gap could have been a function of blacks living in rural areas, which were poor back then. Yeah, they're kind of poor now. And living in the South, which is poor back then. Kind of poor now. I guess everyone's poor now. In addition, we see that the narrowing of the black-white income gap roughly corresponds with blacks moving out of the South. This is not a one-to-one correlation, but it does suggest that simply moving out of the South, which began in earnest in around 1910, is part of the explanation for narrowing the black-white income gap. Yeah, I know. This is, assuming that black and white should be earning the same amount of money. And in the North, where the blacks were slaves who had to earn their freedom before 1865, black wages as a proportion of white wages were higher. In fact, in the North in fact, blacks in the North were wealthier than whites in the South for quite some time. Moreover, the narrowing of the black-white income gap at the national level occurred almost entirely during segregation. So to say that smaller amounts of narrowing that occurred following desegregation was in fact the result of desegregation is something that sounds kind of plausible. There's certainly a little story you can tell, but there's little data for it. The most you could say is that there was a brief acceleration of the narrowing of the black-white income gap immediately after 1965, but that could be a coincidence. And even if you want to say it was a result of the Civil Rights Act, then the acceleration versus the continuation of the previous trend is still only going to be like 2%. That's like when they were trying to eliminate poverty, right? When they started the war on poverty, poverty was going down at an incredible rate, almost 2% a year. And now, ever since the government started their war on poverty and they started the welfare system, it's bottomed out. It's just not bottom out, excuse me. It's just kind of remained stable. That 2% growth has gone away. Government's trying to fix a problem, and they end up creating an industry. Now, as for why black-white income gap narrowed from 1948 at least to 2000, that's another topic. I suspect much of it has to do with economic rise of the South and the migration of blacks away from rural economies. Also, this higher income may not have corresponded with a rise in living standards relative to whites, since the cost of living may increase, but that's more speculative. But desegregation doesn't appear to have any relevance to it. So even the narrowing of the black-white income gap, long touted as prime evidence that segregation was previously suppressing the black wages, the evidence is not so clear on that. Pause. And I'm back. Wealth and employment. Two more things to consider is that up until 1950s, blacks had employment rates similar to that of whites. And the employment rate in blacks grew much more after 1965. 1965. In terms of wealth, in terms of wealth, black wealth as a proportion of white wealth has remained stagnant since 1963. Well, earlier I was talking about the welfare state and stuff. This affects blacks. Think of the willpower it takes not to masturbate, and most people can't do that. So you're asking people not to like get the free gibs. That's really hard to do. That's hard to do if you're white. It's probably even harder to do if you're black. If you're black. Let's see how much more do we have. Oh yeah, we're going good. Well, I just ate a whole rotisserie chicken. That's why I had to take that little break there. And then when I was walking out of my office, I have a DVD collection. Like I had a whole bunch, and then I sold a whole bunch. And How to Marry a Millionaire fell off the shelf and landed on my head. Have you ever seen that movie? It's a Marilyn Monroe movie. Really popular. It actually has a spin-off TV show, which I believe is Lost Media. But it's one of the few Marilyn Monroe films that I actually enjoy, at least her performance. And usually I find her very annoying because she's so squeaky. She's like, I'm that cute, I'm that squeaky. I'm like, but in this movie, she's like quiet. She kind of plays like a mousy girl with glasses. Great, very funny movie. Great example of hypergamy, where women are trading their looks for a lot of money. Okay. Moreover, I would say that the absolute disparity is more important than the black-white ratio. Because let's say you have $10 and Bob has $100. There's a $90 gap. Depending on your job, that's a day's wage or half a day's wage. Now, if you have 100 and Bob has 900, now you're looking at multiple days' wages, and so on and so on. Even though the relation is the same, the practical importance of the gap is growing. Also, the total dollar amount difference is increasing. And these are all 2013 quote-unquote dollars, which adjusted for inflation. And when people say that the relative economic situation of blacks has improved relative to whites since segregation, they're looking at one thing: normal income at the national level. They're not looking at employment, at wealth, or how much all of it, the income gap, has narrowed when controlling for what region in the country you're looking at, or if it's urban or rural. This is exactly what look at this. Look at this writing. This is exactly what he was talking about at the beginning, right? About how you're, what's the word he's using? Lip smack, insert here. Lip smack. Phosphate. Oh, qualitatively, right? There's more to it. There's more to it. You can just look at the numbers, but there's more going on. Perhaps there's evolution going on. Schools. Another argument that segregation depressed black economic success is their lower school funding. Some of you might know my dark backstory. I'm in Michigan now, but I grew up in the south side of Chicago, where the schools are quote-unquote bad. But what makes a bad school bad? Is it lower funding? They just see black people and just lower the funding? No, it's the environment. Maybe the people that go to those schools are dangerous and beating each other up, and that's why people don't want to go to those schools, the public schools anyway, which you're forced to pay for at a point of a gun. Taxation is stopped. Argument segregation, depressed black economic status, or low school funding. On average, from 1890 to 1950, the average of how much each state spent on black schools as a proportion of what they spent on white schools was 56.96%. So they had less funding. But funding for what? For better teachers? What's a quote-unquote better teacher? What has been found in the U.S. is that increased real spending on schools has not increased overall performance since the 1970s. And more importantly, voucher studies have shown that the schools an individual goes to has no real impact on either GPA, standardized test scores, or future college attendance. So in fact, the additional funding didn't matter in 1970 is one thing, but did it matter in 1870? To 1945 or 1954? I'm dyslexic. Well, we don't have the regular standardized test from that time period, but we do have a nationally represented IQ test done in 1917 for all U.S. Army conscripts for World War One. In it, blacks record a mean of 83. I think their mean is the median IQ score for blacks is 85 with a standard deviation of 13, compared to the white score, which is set at 100. So you default set whites to 100 when you're normalizing for IQ. Today, the black mean is still at 85. See, I haven't read this yet, so I'm jumping points ahead. Okay, 2 points. My guess is that they were Howl for G anyway. G is the general intelligence factor in IQ tests. So not all IQ tests are created the same. I didn't know this until Ryan Falk explained it to me in a video long time ago. So IQ tests are differently G loaded. Some of them are heavily G loaded. Some of them, the questions are just kind of there to kind of like work on spatial reasoning or whatever. But you want to have a highly G loaded IQ test. And actually, believe it or not, blacks do worse on highly loaded G-loaded IQ tests than they do on non-ones. Because one of the old arguments against race and IQ arguments was that the tests were culturally biased. Well, blacks actually do better on the culturally biased IQ test, so that's not true. Certainly, there were journalists at the time who did investigative journalism and wrote anecdotal reports of how bad the black schools were. Michael Moore does investigative journalism today, too, about how great the Cuban healthcare system is. Well, poisoning the well there. Walter Durandi visits the USSR in the 1930s and came back writing glowing reviews of the benevolent but firm policies of Stalin. Ugh, God, worse than the Nazis. There's what was it? I was listening to Jocko Unchained, a podcast, and my friend recommended it to me. And it's some good episodes where they're talking about like the left infiltrating America and kind of why there's so many like fucking communists like in this country. And he made an interesting point at the end where he's just like, well, if you're offended by the hammer and sickle, you're not offended by hammer and sickle, but you're offended by the swastika. There's something wrong with you because they're very different. I'm like, well, no, they're both. I mean, he's like they should be equivalently bad. No, the hammer and sickle is way worse. The fucking communists have killed tens of millions more than the Nazis ever did. Anyone that studies history knows that the communists are the real bad guys. I mean, Nazis are bad too, but literally the communists are like the villains of the world. And they're still fucking around. That's the thing. It's like they're worse than the Nazis, but you still have people putting that in their bio. Priorities, people. Maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe they were making things up. Who knows? Black schools were probably worse, but the question is, how much worse, really? And for most people, did it even matter? Most of what people learned in school anyways, they forgot everything. And aside from literacy and basic math, the principal importance of school would be minimal for most people at the time. And the culture of school credentials as a signal to employers haven't developed yet. The culture of school credentials as a signal to employers hadn't developed yet. So at the time, any educational disadvantages, quote unquote, blacks had, whatever they were, if any, would not matter in terms of credential signaling because that hadn't developed yet. And in terms of knowledge, basic literacy and math, that all gets forgotten anyway. You could make an even more basic argument, right? Is that why do, like, let's say the black area is poorer, right? And their taxes are going to fund their black public school. Why should they suck resources from a white area that's richer and send it to the black school? That doesn't even make sense. Maybe the whites don't want to fund a black school. Did they ever think of that? See, this is the problem with statism, right? And this giant tax pool is that you have to fund things you don't want to fund. Right? I remember the old libertarian argument that the left doesn't want war and the right doesn't want abortion, and both sides think that these things are murder, but they're both forced to fund them at the point of a gun. This section is a bit of a digression. In a broad sense, blacks weren't seen as legitimate countrymen. This is exactly what I was just talking about. Weren't seen as legitimate countrymen to some extent for some time in the region. And so, since the blacks were viewed as foreigners to southern whites, who to some extent viewed northern whites as foreigners as well. They didn't think they owed blacks equal school funding any more than they owed people from Peru or Romania or China equal school funding. You don't owe anyone anything. You were not born to owe people debt. You were not born to owe someone your time, your labor. You own your labor. You were not born. Anyone that asks that acts like you have any level of entitlement towards your existence uh, is wrong. You don't own anyone anything. You get to decide where you put your energy, your feelings. You get to decide whether you feel hope for the future. You get to decide all those things. Other people don't get to decide them for you. The black-white IQ, excuse me, the black-white gap in school funding meant as much to them as the American-Chinese gap in school funding, as both the Chinese and blacks are foreign to Southern whites. Remember, nation comes from the word natal. It's a group of people with a common origin. This is why statism is so. It's not hilarious at all. It's actually dangerous. But this is why America is not this great you know experiment, right? It's a nation just like any other, and you need to have more than just be an economic zone. You need to be a people if you're gonna survive. Now you have whatever. Now you can have whatever opinion you want about it. He's so defensive, and say that blacks were rightfully countrymen of Southern whites. Fuck it. No, they weren't. And really proud, pound your fist with self-righteous certainty about it because you know it to be true. That's certainly your viewpoint. All right, Ryan, come on. It's funny. I don't remember all this parts of like his writings or yeah. I think I read if I read this one back in the day, I forgot. But he is funny. I like his stuff when it's just the facts, ma'am. But sometimes it's funny when he inserts stuff. But to understand that it's just your viewpoint, and when you realize that Southern whites viewed blacks the way that we look at an illegal immigrant today, and that the times during which either representation of blacks to repatriation of blacks to Africa or creating a separate black country out of the land in the U.S. were serious proposals were still in living memory at the time. Today, blacks have been part of the U.S. for so long that such proposals probably seem bizarre to you, and they would be bizarre and cruel if implemented today. But also remember that the U.S. had to impose military government in the South in order to pass the 14th Amendment that gave the black citizenships. In Oregon and New Jersey and Ohio renounced their ratification of the 14th Amendment after the fact in protest of this action. Oh no, my fellow black countrymen in Ohio can't vote. This is obviously a symbolic gesture. Oh my god. You call up the the heads of Oregon and New Jersey and Ohio and be like, do you know you can't process their votes. They reneged on the 14th Amendment. It's like, oh, we were about to go back on the 19th Amendment, but the 14th, that's even better. They rub their hands together in glee. Okay, let's see. Obviously, this was a symbolic gesture, but it showed that opposition to the way the 14th Amendment was passed wasn't considered some kooky fringe idea at the time. Some kooky shit, yo. And of course, it is now because if you bring up the use of military governments in the passing of the 14th Amendment, well, only racists talk about that. Oh, well, good. And so it gets dismissed. 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 Racist. Another word made up by the communist fucks over in Russia. The Jewish communist fucks, excuse me. Let's get this right. But yes, understanding that the 14th Amendment was seemed like the granted amnesty to illegals today. Boy, this is a very I've never heard anyone do a parallel like this. This is very interesting. You can tell that Ryan is he's really trying to reach out and like convince whatever the I guess the right winger of a decade ago of this point of view. It didn't work, but it's interesting. It would be creating an alternate method of granting citizenship for a specific group of non-citizens in the U.S. today. And the fact that more whites support granting citizenship to black slaves at the time than supporting granting amnesty to illegals today is support for a theory I have about whites in the past being more neurologically left-wing even if they would be considered today to hold far-right positions by today's standards. Conclusion. The beginning of my line of thinking here was the case involving George Zimmerman. Oh man, George Zimmerman, it was a big deal back then. And Derek Wilson. Among the general public, there was controversy, but among the jurors, there was no controversy. The cop in the case of Wilson and the wannabe cop in the case of Zimmerman were in, and unanimously found to be not guilty. And there were riots and protests in response to these events. God, such simpler times. Watch the South Park episode World War Zimmerman. If you don't know who Zimmerman, well, I can tell you who Zimmerman was. He was a Hispanic guy who got jumped by a black teenager and they shot him in self-defense. The protesters would use these events as an example of white supremacist society. The jurors certainly knew, and of course the Zionist-controlled media kind of spun it that Zimmerman was a white guy. The jurors certainly knew more facts about each case than the general public did. Moreover, whites are more likely to believe Zimmerman and Wilson were justified, and whites do better on tests of current events knowledge. In addition, males do better on current events knowledge tests than females, obviously, and were more satisfied with the Zimmerman verdict than women. This is okay. Women do worse on current event knowledge tests. That my spot. More satisfied, and women do worse on current event knowledge tests. Also, people with higher education levels approve the verdict as well. This is like Kyle Rittenhouse all over again. Or Kyle Rittenhouse like Zimmerman all over again. That was a great trial. Didn't you guys watch the Kyle Rittenhouse trial? Man, that was like edge of your seat viewing. I was sitting at home playing video games, watching Nick Rekieta stream that whole trial. Man, good times. That's like over 2 years ago now. I was texting my friends. Thus, all three factors that correlate with general political and current events knowledge, being white, being male, and having lots of time in school, also correlate with approving Zimmerman's trial verdict. And the people who had the most knowledge, the jurors, unanimously found Zimmerman not guilty. Excuse me. If you go by the literature in news media talking about institutional quote unquote institutional racism and quote unquote white privilege, it is not immediately obvious that the aggregate of all media is any less obsessed with the plight of the coloreds than they were in 1964. Maybe they were, but I have no way of really telling. But let's say Derek Wilson killed the gentle giant, Michael Floyd, or I can't remember his name, in 1961. There was no internet in 1961. What do you know about these events was what a few major news outlets chose to report. This is good too, because even a decade ago, people were starting to realize that the mainstream media, and this is like when Trump, I don't think it's quite, maybe it is when Trump kind of coined the term fake news, but it's good because it got a lot of the normies and the statists to kind of question the industrial media scale and stuff. And now people will look back, he's about to mention Emmett Till and the Holocaust, and they can think about whether these things happened exactly the way they were reported or they were exaggerated. I'll put it like that. There's no internet in 1961, and you knew the events was what a few major outlets chose to report. You know, information when it's only coming through a few sources is very easy to control. And as it happens, a jury also found J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant not guilty of the murder of their killing of Emmett Till. No, not guilty. And what do you know about that event? You know, I was just talking to a friend because we were talking about, you know, Alex Linder dying, and I highly recommended that the Leo Frank book, the specifically Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam's The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 3. You know, and that's a good example of the Jews lying about a guy who clearly murdered and raped a 13-year-old girl, maybe because they wanted to defend the origins of the ADL, but like over 100 years later. So, yeah, talk about manipulation of the media. And what do you know? Oh, and also, if you go back and read that book, you'll see that the Jews had bought all the newspapers in the town and were trying to like concoct a narrative to kind of free Leo Frank and like smear the other the black suspects as racist, but it was actually there was like one paper that was like printing the truth, right? That wasn't controlled by the Jews. And what do you know about this event? Do you know that the facts you know about Emmett Till verdict seem to paint a one-sided story, whereas unbelievable, yes, unbelievable that a jury would find Bryant and Millam not guilty? Question mark. Because we all know that the courts in the South were incredibly unfair to blacks? Question mark. Except there's no really data to support that at the time, and victim surveys from modern times correspond with the police arrest rates. That's boy, you should I'm gonna make a note because we gotta go back to the victim surveys. I remember, was it Molyneux? Someone brought that up at the time, and I remember that shocked me because when you're kind of coming out of the matrix and you grow up, an atheist leftist like I did in the South Side of Chicago, you assume that that's not true. That the arrest rates are out of proportion for blacks. That you know the whites that the white cops, the evil white racist cops are kind of like roaming the neighborhoods, just like picking on black people for no reason. That might not be true. And so like when someone gets their bike stolen and the description of the person is a black person, the cops are going to look and stop black people and arrest a black person for that crime. So there isn't these victim surveys aren't totally out of proportion at all to police arrest records. They're actually very closely in line. I remember I'll have to pull it up, but it's negligible, right? The variation in and then if you think about it, like the cops, why would they go out? And I mean, the cops go out and fish and stuff, of course, but it doesn't make sense to like go down to that particular neighborhood and be like, we gotta find someone that stole a bike, if they're supposed to be looking for a white person, right? The police are more likely to kill a white person in any given arrest situation, and more likely to shoot blacks in simulations, and the black percentage of killing cops is higher than their percentage of being killed by cops. And in fact, black incarceration rates relative to whites is higher than it was during segregation. Black incarceration rates to whites is higher than it was during segregation. No comment. As shown in previous articles, modern institutional racism in terms of policing, corrupt court bias, callbacks, and educational opportunities are very easily revealed to be phantoms, or at least the issue of whether or not they exist is as much more complex than the basic statistics you've heard on Tumblr and HuffPo posts would suggest. Recent studies have shown residential racial segregation has increased in the United States. Chicago's so racially segregated. Chicago's more racially segregated now than it was in the past. This is an improvement over older studies which simply looked at cities and percentages of each race, percentages of race in each city. These newer methods actually look at the likelihood of you having a neighbor of a different race and find that racial segregation is increasing. So when I was in Chicago, I lived in a neighborhood called Beverly, which was racially integrated. And one of the ways that they kept Beverly racially integrated was like when there were periods of white flight, they purposely would have like neighborhood organizations, and they encourage people not to put like for sale signs on their houses, so it wouldn't appear that white flight was happening. So they didn't give off that civilizational signal of self-defense to other whites that like maybe you should move. But mostly with Beverly, the prices kind of kept the normalization of behavior. If we watched the last episode of the Myth of Prejudice. Okay. We already know that schools are more segregated than they were in the late 60s. Now, this is a profound thing. You've been to school. You've had experience of how racially segregated they were. That was close to what it was like during Jim Crow. That we hear so many stories about. How segregated did it seem? Good point. In other places on this site, Sean and I completely forgot about Sean. Sean has his own site called Ideas and Data. I should read some of his articles. He's very good. Another brainy guy. And makes arguments about how currently blacks and Hispanics are not getting a raw deal in employment, courts, or education. But what surprised me is just how much, looking into the past, the old days seem similar to today in terms of a lot of blacks compared to whites. They are drawn parallel. The past is not far away. It's right here. 60 years ago is yesterday. All right, and that's another reading from Segregation. I'm glad I decided to read this one. It was just kind of on a whim, really. Um, I completely forgot about this one. So I will stop it there, and I'll see you, beautiful, beautiful people, tomorrow. Bye bye. Spencer McGreal, signing off. And I guess I should talk about the books. I'm gonna read. Um, I've always been a big fan of Colin Flaherty. I really want to read White Girl Bleed a lot. I've had it for like decades, and I've just never sat down and read it. So another glimpse into the past and how people are reporting on um, race in America. All right, bye bye.